My name is Lawrence Vernon.
When did you become Chief Librarian of the National Library Service?
Well, actually, I became Chief Librarian in 1978, and I served from 78 to 1992 when I retired. But going back before that, I entered the library scene from 1956, shortly after I left high school. And this was under the Chief Librarian at the time, Mr. Leo Bradley, who had just recently been trained as a professional librarian. And I must mention too that at that time, Mr. Alice Gibson was also attached to the library service. Actually, she was there before Mr. Leo Bradley, because from the library was opened in 1935. It was under two administrators. One was Hamilton Anderson, who was archaeological commissioner in Belize, and then Monrad Metzkin. They were not trained librarians, but they were just administering the library service as best they could. And Mr. Alice Gibson was their sort of secretary at the time. That was even before Mr. Bradley was sent to be trained and came back in 1954. She was trained after Mr. Bradley. Just about the same time I was receiving training in the early 1960s. Because at that time, Mr. Bradley he went to study abroad, but Ms. Gibson and myself, we did correspondence courses from the British Library Association. And Ms. Gibson became trained before I was, just a year or two, and I became trained afterwards in 1963. We were the only three trained librarians in the library service at the time. So that even when Mr. Bradley retired and Ms. Gibson took over in 1976 as Chief Librarian, and she retired 2 years after that because she had reached retirement age, I was left as the only trained librarian within the service, so it was a sort of one-man show for some time. And that is why when I took over as Chief Librarian, I emphasized a lot of, I placed a lot of emphasis on training, because before that there was just 2 week summer training that was handled by facilitated by librarians from the UWI School of Librarianship in Jamaica, and they would come for 2 weeks at a time to train mostly the branch librarians and other sub-librarians. But we did need more professionally trained librarians, and this is what I went about seeking support from the Ministry of Education. And actually I got good support, because under my tenure there were 3 trained librarians, 2 of whom went in other ventures, and one remained. That the remaining one is still with us, with Miss Joyce Aguirre. But the other 2 were, if I can call the names, Miss Cecile Reyes. She served for about 2 years, and then she left to go to work at the Central Bank. And Mr. Charles Gibson, who after working for about a year and a half, was sent to be trained as an archivist in the United Kingdom. And so again, I remained the only person working at the library at the time as a trained librarian. So training then was my emphasis at the time, as I mentioned.
The 1935, the first branch of the library, you had mentioned Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Monrad Metzkin. and
Yes.
Miss Gibson being there from that very beginning.
Mhm.
Well, maybe not from the very beginning. She would have been about 12 years old in 1935.
No, well, yeah, I know she came in some years after. I believe she was still a teenager at the time, and she was working at the library as a secretary to these two people,
Okay.
because these two people stayed there for some time, right? At least until Mr. Bradley was trained in 1954. So she was there for quite some time. Well, Robert Sidney Thornton was is described as being Belize's first millionaire, and he was an industrious person. He was involved in mahogany and mahogany logging and export, and this is where he made his millions from. And he was also involved to some extent with the first political movement in Belize, the People's United Party. Actually, the George Price used to work with him in his office as a secretary, and he was the one who encouraged Price to be involved with the People's United Party. And I must mention too that Sidney Thornton was a sort of anti-colonialist. Most of the people at the time supported colonialism, and they liked the British and whatnot. And Sidney Thornton did not really relish them. Actually, his father was a British military man, and his mother was a local Belizean, British Honduran at the time. So that Thornton encouraged Price to take up this nationalistic attitude, and he formed the People's United Party, and that's another history. But Thornton was a very kind man, and he built many houses around Belize City for people who needed the houses. Although they had his trademark, they all had yellow windows against the white background. Some of the houses are still existing today. So one of the houses that was built by him was not really for a library. It was for a residential structure, and the people at the time who were administering the library sort of advocated for the building to be used for a library, and so that's when Sidney Thornton donated the building on North Front Street to be used exclusively as a library. If it ceased to be used as a library, then it would revert to the Thornton estate.
You gave definitely a rich history. I want to know how library services happen to have expanded. You know, there were libraries in schools, there were libraries in villages here, there, sub-libraries, they call them. And in the 1950s, all the way to Monkey River, San Antonio, Toledo, were you able to go to these places, and how long did it take for you to reach there? Let's say, I know transportation was different then, the road was different then. Please walk us through, let's say, if you can recall, in the 1950s, what it took to reach these different service points.
Yes, well, I should mention that in the early days, the branches, as we call them now, were established in the 5, 6 main towns, but these were just a box of books that was deposited in the district commissioner's office. The district commissioner was the term used in those days, in his office, and they were just left there. And I don't think they were used very much because it was not in the interest of any of the clerks in the office to act as library workers. And so After a while, that was removed, and we sought out other accommodation for the for the books. And this was done mostly in, as you say, in some schools, in the town halls, town board buildings, and even in one or two instances, they were enclosed in people's private homes. Some people had the space in their lower flat, and the library could be established there. But as far as getting to these spaces, it was not very easy. I recall with traveling with the then Chief Librarian, Leah Bradley, to Punta Gorda by boat, by Heron H, and it took quite a long time to get there. We'd leave here about 2 in the afternoon and arrive in Punta Gorda about 7 or 8 the following morning. So that was that was the traveling time and distance. Once we got there, we would spend maybe about 5 or 6 days, because we had 1 or 2 sub-libraries in the district too, that we would travel to, San Antonio, and then 1 or 2 others, but even Barranco at the time. And that was going by boat, and traveling over land, it was strictly by private transportation, public transportation, the bus lines. I remember using Batty Bus and Sabanis Bus and that type of thing. And because the library at that time couldn't afford any of its own transportation. This didn't come about until in I forget the year, but it was the British Council who was stationed in Belize, and they had a library and they had a vehicle. And when they left Belize, they left the Land Rover with the library. And so at that time, we were able to get to more places rather than just the public transportation. But in those days also, the roads were not in good condition. And so it took a long time to get to places like Cayo, and especially Cayo and Curacao.
How did you manage to supervise so many branches? I mean, there was, first of all, the phones. I mean, I know when you look at the phone books from back then to now, the phone books back then were the size of a like a booklet by our standards. And then now
Yes.
you have these almost what you would almost call half a Bible, you know? So,
I know.
that in and of itself. Then you also had mail by post. So how was it
Mhm.
coordinating with that type of those conditions?
You mentioned it just now. It was mostly by post, posting letters, posting packages, and of course, the matter of getting books to these places was quite was very difficult, because we could only take a certain amount of books on the bus, for instance, and so very quickly the people who were reading, using the libraries, complained that the books were old and they were not being replaced. So that was one of the challenges we faced at the time. Miss Gibson was sort of the person who instigated the beginning of a mobile library. It was not a vehicle as such, but she and myself would charter a vehicle, a taxi, and take books out. I remember the Mascal was the first place we did that. We would pack up some books in the taxi and take it out to Mascal, and we would issue the books mostly to the children, and then in another 2 weeks we would go back, collect the books, and use other books. So Moscow was the pioneering place for that. We did get a van. So it was a van donated by one of these places, UNESCO or one of them. And we actually converted that van into a mobile library. We built some wooden shelves in the van, and they equipped it with books. And this is what went out for many years, the west and north of the country. So that, although it wasn't a purposely built mobile library, it was something that we used, and it was well appreciated. The Barnabas Institute was built in the early 50s, because the library moved in there in 1954. That in itself was not designed as a library per se. The upper floor was for uh, a more a reading room than an actual I remember a conference rooms or something like that. But we actually made it into I wouldn't say we, because I wasn't there at the time, but the people who thought it should move from the Northfront Street to the Bliss Institute. Maybe they had good reasons for that. And in retrospect, in hindsight, I don't think it was a good move, because there was no expansion, there was no room for expansion for the library. And eventually we had to move back most of the things, especially the children's section, back to Northfront Street. And that only remained as an adult library, adult and reference library at the Bliss Institute. It was used quite a lot as a library. Most people knew it as the headquarters of the library service, at least the students who were using it at the time and who grew up in it. And we did the best we could, and as I say, we had to eventually move some of the children, the things out of the Bliss Institute and take it back to the Northfront Street Library. But it is, maybe that's the reason too why we looked at building our own building, which is today the Leo Bradley Library, because for reasons of space mostly and facilities.
And the funding for this, how supportive has the government been, or was the government at that time? I had seen different types of relationships, as you have said, between the town hall and the library. I can clearly recall being a young child in Dangriga and going to the town hall for the library. That's my first library experience.
Okay.
One of my first memories. So early 80s in Dangriga. And then I came back, and all of a sudden, hey, the library had its own building.
Mm-hmm.
But that government support, it came at the town level and also at the national level, you would say?
It came at the town level and much earlier, and much more generously, because they afforded us in San Ignacio, for instance, Dangriga, they afforded us the use of the town halls. And the matter of government actually being interested in building libraries for us, I think came about because we sort of got involved with the prime minister at the time, George Price, who was a very avid reader, and we could have sort of approached him and and show him the need to have buildings in the library buildings in at least in the main towns. And so we had that building built in Coruscant, firstly, and I think there was not another building until Punta Gorda. But the government did see the need, and they supported us to the extent of eventually constructing the libraries for us. Um, well, I used to visit the library quite a lot, especially when it from before it moved from the North Front Street, but when it went over to the Bliss Institute, I followed it, and I used to sit in the reading room and read a lot. And this lately Bradley, who was chief librarian at the time, said to me one day that they have a vacancy and if I would like to fill that. This was in 1956. And so I didn't really have any career path in mind. I had always wanted to sort of be a pilot, but at the time, I said I'll do this in the meantime, and I got sort of involved with library work, and so I stayed on, and I worked myself up through the ranks, library assistant, junior assistant librarian, and things like that, until 1978, when the post was vacant when Miss Gibson retired, and I was appointed to the post by the then government. After a while, I settled down, and I found it so rewarding, right? Especially the information aspect of it, providing information to people, to people who needed it, and this even prompted me to put together passages, books, not books really, but little research material that people were asking about, especially the cultural groups and the political parties at the time. And so I eventually did my own research, and I put this together, and many years after these were published. And that's what I find very rewarding, because people need information, and I feel that I could have disseminated this information to them and they would be satisfied.
I was going to ask about your literary life because I said which came first, the writing or the librarianship? You know, you are an avid writer and reader and researcher, of course. And I wanted to know at same thing, you know, did you say one day I will write, X amount of books, or did it just happen that as it came up, you addressed the need?
Yes, well, you know, as a lot of people who like to read, they eventually start to want to put something on paper for themselves, something that they own, right? And this is what really happened. I experimented with them short stories, and we formed a little group of about 4 of us, including the late John Watler, Leo Bradley, and Newton Stewart. And then we would write a short story a week, and meet and critique each other's stories. And this really was a jumping off point for to go into more detailed writing. Eventually, as I mentioned before, I got to like doing research, so I went into research writing, and I published five or six books so far in political parties and the cultural groups, biographies of Andy Palacio and Monrad Metzkin, and the the latest one is in the pipeline, which is finished on the biography of Philip Colson, which was commissioned by Niche.
Do you have any timeless advice that you would want to share with the future chief librarians?
Yes. Just as I made librarianship, library science, librarianship my career, it is something that you have to be really dedicated to. It isn't so much as liking to read or liking books. It's more to like people, because the people are the ones we serve, and the people are the ones who we encourage to come into the library to read, and to even encourage their children to read. And so we agitate to bring people closer to the library, not necessarily to books, because in this day of technology, the book seems to be not dying, but being replaced. So I would encourage any person who have an inclination to liking to serve people. The library service is one of the key areas and the key places that will take you to that plateau.
This year, the 85th anniversary, the theme is Belize Public Libraries, transforming, enriching, and uplifting communities since 1935. How do you feel about this theme?
I like the theme because it describes what library services are really about, uplifting, with the matter of creating a base from, although we are not involved in formal education, it is informal education that we are involved in. And this tends to uplift any person who wishes to take advantage of the services that the library offers.